So I'm gonna take about 15 minutes to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing, and in particular, Ken and Rowley wanted me to talk about the Youth Climate Corps campaign, which they thought would be of particular interest to this audience, notwithstanding the fact that so many of us have gray hairs, and but I'm hoping to use most of the hour for discussion and Q&A. I want to just start by speaking to what isn't working, particularly at the federal level when it comes to confronting the climate emergency. My take at this point is that we are starting, the federal government is starting to do stuff. And after 20 years of our greenhouse gas emissions simply plateauing at an historic high, we are now in a period where we're going to start to see, I believe, a gradual bending of the curve. Thankfully, finally. That's the good news. The bad news is it won't be anything at the pitch and pace that the science and justice demands of us. Now, why is that? One piece of it, I think there's really three core explanations for why the federal government appears stuck. One is that they are trying to incentivize their way to victory. And I fear it's not going to work. When you look at there's a whole laundry list of things that the federal government is doing on climate, but really the bulk of the heavy lifting centers around two core policies from the federal government. The first is the escalating carbon price, and the second is this basket, this suite of tax credits ranging from 15 to 30%, where the feds will offer a tax incentive for those who invest in clean tech and clean energy. Now, don't get me wrong, I have no great objection to either of these things. I support carbon pricing. I think these might work. But when I stand back and look at it, it appears to me that the federal government is effectively privatizing climate leadership. They're putting these policies in the window, the tax, the carbon price, and now all of these tax credits. And they're hoping that somebody will step forward in the private sector and claim those credits to manufacture or build what needs to be done and deployed. And some will, but not at speed and scale. They're incentivizing their way to victory. It's not going to work. This is no way to prosecute the fight of our lives. The second piece of what's missing is that it remains so technical, and all of these policies. There's no grand invitation to society at large to undertake a great undertaking together, right? Like when I pose this question to audiences, does this look and sound and feel like an emergency response to you, where you're being invited to mobilize? I'm not feeling it either. And the third piece of what's missing is that there has yet to be a compelling, hopeful counteroffer to fossil fuel workers and communities who feel economically reliant on the status quo. And I'm convinced that we cannot win without it. We're not going to get a strong and robust oil and gas emissions cap without that compelling just transition counteroffer. And it's a bit of a mystery to me why it isn't forthcoming. We've had after promising for years that there would be a Just Transition Act, we've now got, it's been rebranded by the feds as the Sustainable Jobs Plan. I'm not wanting to quibble about what to call the thing, but when I met with Minister Wilkinson shortly after that was released, my feeling was, again, there's nothing here I object to, but I don't think this is going to politically achieve what you need it to achieve. Like, there's nothing here for people to get excited about. And you look at how things like the just transition debate unfolds in Alberta. Imagine how differently it would unfold if we were making that compelling counteroffer that could say to people, you need not fear this transition. We've got your back. We have something for everyone. Now, in contrast to all of that, we at the Climate Emergency Unit, let me take a step back and explain the history here. My book came out 2.5 years ago. I started to meet with political leaders across the country. You know, these are fun meetings. As many of you know, my book is structured around lessons from the Second World War. Turns out a lot of these people are war buffs, you know, World War II buffs. We have these really fun conversations. But nothing comes of them. And nothing will come of them if it's not backed up by a drumbeat of political pressure. And I realized I needed having left the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives 4 years ago, I needed a home again to try to build that drumbeat. And David Suzuki and Tara Cullis gave me this home with the David Suzuki Institute to create this thing called the Climate Emergency Unit. I'm going to throw the link in the chat right now. So that's our website. I'd really encourage you all to sign up for the newsletter. Every couple of weeks, we put a newsletter out just keeping people appraised of our campaigns, actions you can take, that kind of thing. But the whole idea of the model of the Climate Emergency Unit is to convene coalition tables and joint campaigns around the kinds of genuine emergency ideas that I proposed in the book. And so that's the work that we do with the Climate Emergency Unit. We've been part of creating the BC Climate Emergency Campaign. We had a hand in trying and jointly launching the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign. We're part of creating a Just Transition Coalition in Newfoundland. We partnered with CAPE to launch the campaign to ban fossil fuel advertising. But there's two campaigns that live with us. And oh, Rolly, you beat me to the punch there, sharing the 6 markers. So all of the work that we do is structured around the 6 markers of emergency, and I'm just going to share them with you on the screen for a moment. This is our framework that we employ at the CU. You know, for all of us who wonder, when do you know when a government, federal, provincial, municipal, or the leadership of any large institution, a union, a post-secondary institution, a faith institution, a crown enterprise, when do you know when it's actually in emergency mode? You know when it spends what it takes to win, when it creates new institutions to get the job done, when it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures, when it tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency, when it makes a commitment to leave no one behind, when it actually makes that compelling counteroffer that I was just speaking to, that says to people, you don't need to worry about your employment. There will be a good jobs guarantee for everyone. And when it centers Indigenous leadership rights and title. So those are our 6 markers of emergency. And all of the campaigns that we're involved in are rooted in those 6 markers. So Ken and Rolly wanted me to highlight in particular one of our campaigns, and that's the one for Youth Climate Corps, which I'm pretty excited about, which is starting to build some momentum, and which hits multiple of those markers around spending what it takes. It's the creation of a new institution. It commits to leave no one behind. But I thought maybe I'd start by, we produced this really kind of nice, inspiring 2-minute video about it with an Edmonton-based young outfit called Sticks and Stones. I thought I would just show you the video. It's just 2 minutes, and then I'll explain a little bit more about the Youth Climate Corps. So let's give it a shot. Here you go. All right, y'all ready? Here it is.
Young people are good at making history.
Even when the fight felt unwinnable.
Or unpopular.
Or inconvenient.
When we knew the truth,
we fought. We know the scale of the climate emergency.
We're fighting, even as systems break down.
Wages stagnate,
and the cost of basic survival skyrockets.
We keep showing up.
But our leaders,
they're not there yet.
There has been no invitation to confront this civilizational threat.
No public programs to use our talent and energies. We're told only to wait, quietly, if we don't mind.
But we're not waiting anymore.
And it starts
With the Youth Climate Corps,
It's time for a brash and transformative new public program.
one that puts thousands of young people to work, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and strengthening communities.
building new renewable energy projects,
protecting biodiversity,
Retrofitting our buildings
So we can live in dignity and safety and take care of each other as we face the unprecedented.
We deserve nothing less than good green work.
a living wage,
And access to union representation.
a program that places indigenous knowledge and self-determination at its heart.
A program that invests in equity.
And making the future of work one in which we can all see ourselves.
A program that provides a pathway to continuing education and a career confronting the climate crisis. And a program that can say to every person under 35,
if you understand that we face a climate emergency,
and you want to meet this generational challenge now, then we have a place for you.
No one will be turned away because we've tried our hand at making history.
Now we're ready to defend our future.
How will we win?
Organize,
Advocate.
Vote
join the movement for a youth climate corps.
at climateemergencyunit.ca/climatecorps.
All right, there you go. I hope you liked it. So let me give a little bit more background about the YCC. And Sticks and Stones, by the way, is the little video company that put that together. So as we envision it, the YCC would be a 2-year federally funded training and employment program for people 35 and under that would empower them to work in their communities and across the country on both climate mitigation and adaptation work. So engaged in meaningful work, restoring ecosystems, managing forests to reduce wildfire risks, responding in climate disasters, maybe supplanting the military in terms of that disaster response, enhancing community resilience and safety, whether it's a heat dome or a flood or fire, but also building new climate infrastructure. So getting trained up on renewable energy projects, building retrofits, public transit projects, and also engaging in low carbon care work like elder care or child care. So for 2 years, young people would be well paid as they get trained up in this vital work, and work that might in fact set them on a new life and career course. Now, to be clear, we are not trying to kickstart the creation of a new nonprofit youth program. That's too small. The climate emergency is all about speed and scale, and it needs to be state-led, and it needs to be big. There's a plethora of student and youth employment and training programs across the country. Some of them run by the Fed, some of them by provinces, and they tend to offer placements for a few dozen, or even in some cases a few hundred young people a year, mostly in sort of 4-month summer wage top-up programs or volunteer internships. Meeting the climate emergency requires something much more grand. And so we're envisioning a government program that turns no one away, for which the only requirement for entry is the desire to enlist. I mean, if you think about it, there is really only one federal youth training and employment program in Canada that is genuinely barrier-free, particularly for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and you know what it is. It's the military. And this would be a more positive alternative. But we see local governments and communities guiding what projects would be supported and how the funding and the young people would be deployed so as to make sure that the work maximizes greenhouse gas reductions and aligns with local and provincial climate plans. But it's our contention that at a time when many communities are grappling with future prospects for young people, when there's clear research evidence now showing just how many young people are wrestling with climate anxiety and mental health, that the YCC could be this hopeful solution and captivate people's excitement, and it would signal at a societal level that young people are now being invited to join in this grand societal and economic transformation. And I also believe this is winnable, that it's a campaign that can galvanize and inspire people, like earlier campaigns like the student divestment movement. You know, it can provide a focal point for young and for youth and student climate action. And, you know, if you think about it, many of us who work in the climate space, think about how many leaders we work with today in the climate movement who are alumni of the campus divestment movement. Well, maybe the campaign for the YCC can provide a new generation of young climate leaders for which we can be grateful for years to come. And once we win a youth climate corps, you know, when I said earlier, it doesn't look and sound and feel like a real emergency response yet. But once we win a youth climate corps, provided we win it at scale, it would send an electrifying signal, right? It would say, now our governments are genuinely entering emergency mode. And as many of you know, in my book, I'm pulling these lessons from that earlier existential threat, the Second World War. And so that's where this idea for the Youth Climate Corps came. And when I'm giving talks now, particularly to young people in post-secondary settings or secondary settings, I always make a point of saying to them, Canada in World War II was a population of about 11 million people. And remarkably, over 1 million of them enlisted, which is just mind-blowing, isn't it? But even more staggering, 64% of those who enlisted were under the age of 21. So when I'm speaking to young people, I say, they were you. And they left their farms and they delayed their careers and they deferred their post-secondary studies because they understood the emergency to be in that moment. And they volunteered to meet this civilizational threat of their generation. And, in the early days of the war, we weren't even set up to receive them. I interviewed one Chinese-Canadian vet for the book who passed away shortly after the book was published, who recalled spending his first few months training with broom handles for rifles because they weren't ready. But no one who enlisted was turned away. That signals emergency. And today, when I give talks, to young people across the country, I am convinced that tens of thousands of them are once again eager to serve, ready to confront this civilizational threat. I can feel it every time I present this idea. It resonates. But what I say to them is, look at all those young people who signed up in the war. Where's your goddamn invitation? Sorry about that. My phone is going. So our country hasn't yet issued them that kind of invitation. But we are envisioning something big here. There are roughly 10 million people in Canada between the ages of 18 and 35. If only 5% of them were moved to enlist in a program like the YCC, that's 500,000 people. That's 500,000 people saying, I'm ready to serve. I'm ready to meet this emergency. That signals emergency. That's what makes this idea a game changer. So I have a few other ideas I'm happy to share about how you can help with a campaign like this, but maybe I'll save that for later, closer to the end of the hour, and happy to open this up to discussion about either the YCC or the rest of our work in the moment we find ourselves in.
Thanks. That's a great overview. I'm hearing echo from No?
It's all good.
Okay, thank you. Great overview. First thing I want to ask is, are there any countries that are taking this seriously? Obviously, in Europe, they're cutting their greenhouse gases, carbon footprint. Are any of them doing what you envision they should be doing in general, or youth, or other ways?
Um, when you look at our 6 markers of emergency, I'm not aware of any national government that hits the markers. Now that said, there are many countries, particularly in Europe, as you say, that are kicking our butt. When you look at the polling of Canadians on climate, the good news is Canadians. It's very important to Canadians that we be seen as leaders. That's the good news. The bad news is they mistakenly think we are. But of course, as many of you know, when you look at greenhouse gas emissions among the G7, we're dead last. And so there are certainly other countries that are more effectively bending the curve and driving down their emissions. But I wouldn't say they're hitting all the markers. They are doing a better job of spending. Look at what's happened in Europe since the invasion in terms of the mass adoption of heat pumps and things like that. So they are starting to hit the markers, but not quite at scale. That said, I do think there are some local governments that are starting to. Some of you have probably heard me say, and I'm shamelessly biased in this, because my wife is the Vancouver City Councillor who moved Vancouver's climate emergency motion, Christine Boyle. But I think Vancouver has a climate emergency plan, an actual climate emergency plan. It's a bit stalled out under its new council, but they were spending what you would expect for a municipal government. They were creating new institutions like neighborhood energy utilities with heat exchange and so on. But the key thing they were doing is marker 3, move to mandatory. So in my city, I know most of you folks are back east, not all of you, but most of you. In my city of Vancouver, new buildings have not been allowed to use fossil fuels for space and water heating as of January a year and a half. That's almost a decade sooner than our provincial targets, let alone federal targets. That's what I mean by near-term mandatory dates. So there's pockets of places that are doing bits of this, but we got our work cut out.
Why without many places in Europe adopting much of what you're saying, why do you think they're doing so much better?
Well, so first of all, the invasion of Ukraine certainly galvanized. Just led to a leap forward in some of this adaptation by necessity, because they had to supplant Russian gas in a hurry, and so suddenly it got treated with the urgency that something like that has to be treated with. It's just a bloody shame that it takes something like this. The other thing that's notable, when you look at those comparisons in the G7, the 2 countries that do the best are the UK and Germany. And much of that was actually under conservative governments. So there's something there where climate hasn't been politically weaponized the way it has unfolded in North America. But in some ways, North America is the outlier, not them. And that's a shame. But again, back to Vancouver, part of what's interesting about the Vancouver story is that those climate emergency actions were passed across the political spectrum. They weren't politically weaponized. And that speaks to the youth movement, the student movement, and so on, who basically made it who brought that this is the tie-in with the Youth Climate Corps. In the Vancouver experience, these motions passed unanimously. And how did that happen? Well, I joke, part of it is, because my wife's really good at her job and very convincing. But she would say, because each time those key votes happened, and it was just pre-pandemic, you had dozens of high school students skip school, rally outside, speak before council very compellingly, fill the galleries, and it was in the context of this charged intergenerational justice reckoning that they basically made it politically impossible even for the conservatives to vote no. And so it isn't weaponized here.
Seth, with COVID, in some ways, we had an emergency. They responded on scale. They communicated. They spent what it took. Thoughts on what's missing there?
So COVID is yet another example of where I would say in the first year of COVID, the federal government hit the markers. They certainly were spending a lot of money. They quickly pivoted and created new institutions like the CERB and the wage subsidy. We clearly had mandatory measures. They told the truth with daily press briefings. They increased, they sent money to lower income people and people who couldn't work. And they did a decent job of working with First Nations on what the emergency response needed to be there. So at one level, that's just in the same way that my book excavates this 80-year-old reminder. We've all lived through this experience. What all of these emergencies have in common is, this alchemy of events and leadership that shifts the zeitgeist and moves us into emergency mode. The curse of climate, in comparison, is that it doesn't happen all at once. These events, these extreme weather events, happen here, and then they happen here, and then they happen here. And so they don't galvanize us all at once. And it moves in slower motion, which makes it challenging. And they have an industry, the fossil fuel industry, doing everything in its power and spending oodles of money preventing the emergency response, which was not the case with COVID. That said, I want to point out one thing around marker 5, leave no one behind, and the importance of tackling inequality here. When we all reflect on those first 2 years of COVID, we experienced something remarkable and some whiplash. We all in the first few months, we witnessed a level of social solidarity that none of us have ever seen in our lifetime. And then in the space of a year, we pissed it all away. So we went from this incredible high to this incredible low. And I believe that one of the reasons for that is because while the government did things to support lower income people, the one notable thing they didn't do, which they did do in the Second World War, is address the top end. What we know is that the COVID years have seen an incredible amassment of tens of billions of dollars in the hands of the wealthiest Canadians. Like the billionaires in Canada have just seen an extraordinary growth in their collective wealth. In the first year alone of $87 billion. And the corporate sector has recorded the highest profits in the history of the country. And in particular, the oil and gas sector, the financial sector, the food grocery sector have just made money hand over fist. Now, for the historians among you, you will know that kind of grotesque profiteering in the First World War is what undermines social solidarity and mobilization and recruitment, which is why in the Second World War, one of the first things the Mackenzie King government did was they brought in an excess profits tax. The kind of profiteering that has marked the pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. They structured the tax system to make it illegal. And so remember in the early months of the pandemic, the mantra was we're all in this together, right? Except it turns out we weren't. Some people were sacrificing a lot and some people were making out like bandits. And I think that undermined the social solidarity and kind of puts wind in the sails of the anti-social, anti-mandate movement that we've seen.
Just you mentioned, Seth, a while ago that the Youth Climate Corps is starting to gain momentum. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? That's a great, I like to hear that, so I'd just like to know a little bit more about it.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to share where it's all going, and if I can multitask, I'll share some links with you. But on the website, if first of all, I gave you the link earlier to the website, but if you go to campaigns, go to the Youth
Yeah.
Climate Corps campaign, there's a letter writing tool that hundreds of people have started to use, directed to key federal leaders. We've been holding events and online events. Just last Monday, so one of the creative things, the letter writing tool can be used by anyone of any age, including all you folks. But we've also started this creative thing where people 35 and under can create mock cover letters applying for YCC jobs that don't yet exist. Um, uh, and then, so last Monday, we had a group of young people, including Jaden, who I see on this call, go and bring them to Carla Qualtrough in Delta, BC. About 100 of them, because Carla Qualtrough is the federal minister of employment. And we're going to roll out things like that across the country. We're hoping to do something like that in the Toronto area in particular, because Marcy Ian is the federal minister of youth who's in Toronto Centre, and just try to draw them out. I think, by the way, I'm sure many of you listen to CBC's What on Earth, but that Carla Qualtrough action, I think, is going to be featured on What on Earth this Sunday. I don't know for certain. It depends what other news was happening, but they were there and covering it.
Another question has to do with how you're appealing to youth in the far north, in Nunavut and so on. Is that a tougher nut to crack, or?
I mean, the truth is, yes, we don't have capacity up there, and we're just a team of 7 people. So we're reliant on people running with these ideas. So whether you're a young person or whether you're an older person, I think the way that we win the things that we're campaigning on is that the federal government needs to hear about it from civil society groups that have influence. The labor movement, faith organizations, indigenous organizations. Probably the truth is less grassroots and more institutional. So, for example, the other Just Transition campaign we have is for the Just Transition Transfer, a new federal transfer to fund climate infrastructure. And there we're trying to build support among municipal governments, transit authorities, housing authorities, who could say to the feds, look, we can't keep trying to beg you for money every year. We need stable, regularized federal transfers to pay for climate infrastructure. Same with the Youth Climate Corps. I'm going to be presenting in a few weeks to the Assembly of First Nations Environment Committee, so there is some representation there from the north, but we are, and we're hoping to engage more. So for those of you who have connections to a labor local or a faith group or municipal government, getting motions passed and sending it up the chain to the feds saying this is the kind of transformative institution we're looking for, all of that's helpful. And I see that Jaden has just put the link to the Youth Climate Corps site. That's Jaden. That's the Youth Climate Corps in Vancouver, though, the BC one. So let me just offer up the link.
I think I put it up a bit earlier, but we can put it up again.
Did you? Okay.
No, I'll put it up again.
Any other questions?
If any of you want to ask a question, just you can use someone as Evelyn Gigantes. Your hands up.
I'm wondering if you have the same consciousness as we here in Ontario do, and certainly in the Maritimes and New Brunswick, that it's not just the oil and gas industry that is fighting against climate change action, to put it mildly, but also the nuclear industry. They are so powerful in terms of their activity through the federal government, at the provincial level. It's driving us crazy, and it's just the wrong thing to be doing, for a million reasons. Nuclear.
The industry is certainly active. It's not active in British Columbia. But I think we don't have nuke out here, and I don't think anyone's proposing it. But there's no doubt that it is got some traction with the feds and with a number of other provincial governments. And I do find it distracting. I may have a slightly different take from you, which is that, and I say this, I cut my teeth politically as a kid in the anti-nuke movement. My take now is, well, because I'm like everyone, I'm always hearkening back to World War II. Let me invoke and play around with the famous line from Mackenzie King: "Nuclear if necessary, but not necessarily nuclear." I'd be open to anything, but everything is about speed and scale now, and nuclear does not lend itself to speed and scale. Wind and solar lend themselves to speed and scale. Look how quickly they can be deployed in an emergency, like we've seen in Europe in the last year. Whereas nuclear is so expensive and so faces so many regulatory burdens. For example, if you ask people, which would you feel comfortable with in your neighborhood, a solar array or a nuclear plant? The answer to that question probably tells you everything you need to know about speed and scale. That said, I'm not someone who thinks we should phase out what we have, at least not now, not right now, maybe eventually. But it is irksome to me for sure, and I think you and I agree with this, that for some reason, these politicians gravitate to the unproven shiny technology, the nuclear, the carbon capture, the hydrogen, when the far less expensive and more effective solutions are sitting there on the shelf waiting for mass deployment. And that's where our energy should be focused.
Seth, the trouble with nuclear right now is it is gobbling money. There's a line wrong. That means that funding is not going in the right places at all. The other thing that irks me is in the new federal announcements coming out of the budget, the statement that they're more anxious to fund firms that will be good to their workers. In other words, look for firms that are organized. Well, that means nuclear power, and it means oil and gas. And I'm a great old socialist, and it just drives me crazy that they've set it up so that, people on the left will be happy about this. And it really is undercutting what should be happening fast and cheaply.
I mean, I actually was fine with that part of the budget. I do think if we're providing a public subsidy, we should expect certain standards in exchange. But in a way, we're getting caught in the whole problem with the model. What we need in terms of renewable energy and high-speed rail and zero-emission affordable homes, these things are inherently public. But the whole problem is that if your whole model hinges on tax credits, you're waiting for the private sector to step forward and do what we should just be doing, and doing in the public sector, and ensuring that the wages are good that way. Or minimally, if we're doing it in partnership with the private sector, taking an equity stake. Like they're giving these huge subsidies. Let me give you an example. A big piece of these credits is taking the form of about $13 billion to land this Volkswagen battery plant in Ontario. Now, again, this is what I object to about the approach of credits. That battery plant was going to happen. The only question was who would land it, us or the Americans? And so we end up in this slug match around who's going to sweeten the pot and win the deal, but it doesn't change the equation. We change the equation by simply creating these new institutions ourselves.
I'll ask one more question, Ken, and then go back to you. Seth, as you know, in June 2019, the feds declared a climate emergency. And mind you, in the same week, I think they also announced the expansion of, might have been TMX, I forget. So that took away from their credibility to a great extent. But when I look at the 6 markers of the climate emergency that you've come up with, spend what it takes, create new institutions, and shift from voluntary to mandatory. And we're seeing regs now for ZEVs, and of course there's going to be a cap on emissions and so on. My sense when I look at that is that we're kind of hitting each of those marks. Like maybe we're not hitting it with the force, obviously, as you said before, that the force that it needs, and we're not hitting it, bang on. But like, is there any? It almost seems that the feds have copied your formula. I mean, that's giving you maybe way too much credit. I don't know, but I see that they're doing a lot of this. So, how close are we to actually dealing with this climate emergency? Because I think you had mentioned before, or it might have been on your website or something I heard, that if you don't deal with it in 6 years or in 4 to 5 years, well, it's kind of too late. If you haven't, if you have an emergency and you don't deal with it in 4 or 5 years, you're kind of missing it. Just wondering if you can,
Well, Rolly, I wish they were copying us or taking our advice. I really don't think so. I mean, let me walk you through the markers. Spend what it takes to win. So lots of consensus now in a whole campaign saying we should be spending 2% of GDP to tackle the climate. 2% of GDP in Canada is about $57 billion a year. The feds generously are spending about $12 billion. So they're not spending what it takes to win. They're off by a 5-fold order of magnitude. Are they creating new institutions to get the job done? No, I don't see the institutions. The Just Transition Transfer, the Youth Climate Corps, new crown corporations to mass produce and deploy these things. That's what would signal we're doing it. They're not doing it. Now, you raise an interesting one around marker number 3, move to mandatory, like a regulatory approach. So they are moving in that direction, as you say, with zero emission vehicles, a little bit slowly on housing and new buildings, and with the oil and gas cap, which remains to be seen. The problem is the dates that they set don't communicate emergency, they communicate the opposite of emergency. The ZEV mandates 2035, right? So much of the regulatory kick-in, if you will, is back-end loaded to the end of the decade or 2030. Now, here's the thing about climate change and GHGs. Annual emissions aren't what's driving climate change. As many of you know, what drives climate change is the accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So the shape of the curve really matters. I'm going to just take everyone back to your grade 8 math class here. If we're here and 2030 is here, it makes a big difference if you have a concave curve or a convex curve getting there. Are you back end loading it or are you front end loading it? Because the area under the curve is very different. And the area under the curve, that's what drives climate change. But it's also the case that when you back end load it, you're not accountable. Someone else is in government.
Yeah.
And this is what worries me the most about the federal Liberals' approach. It's not future-proofed to a change in government. When your policies hinge on a carbon price and tax credits, another government, as you folks well know in Ontario, can just come along and get rid of it. But when you create new institutions they're much harder to unwind. And so I think that's where we need to go. By the way, if you ever, I have the 6 markers. For all of you who have trouble remembering all 6 markers, there's a little shorthand trick, a little heuristic I offer for knowing if a government's actually in emergency mode. And it's this: look at the reaction of the fossil fuel companies. If the fossil fuel companies are on the stage with your government representatives saying we can get behind this plan, you ain't got a plan. But if you can see the whites of their eyes and they look panicked, then you might have a plan. And back to my wife and the Vancouver experience, when she was first elected 4.5 years ago and passed this motion, and staff had 90 days to come up with a new climate plan for the city. And just before it went public, the city had a protocol that they would brief Fortis BC, our gas company, like Enbridge for those of you in Ontario. And right away, some VP Mucky Muck calls the city manager with his hair on fire. And that night when we were going to bed, Chris, my wife, was like, okay, now I know we have a good plan. And I see Jaden has put the link in the chat now to our climate, to the Youth Climate Corps. Thanks for that, Jaden.
So Ken, Ann McAllister. Can you unmute yourself, Ann?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Thank you. Seth, I was wanting to get your take on the fact that the renewable energy transition seems to be, well, what seems to be happening in the name of the renewable transition is a big push on mining rare earth metals, and particularly at what seem to be unsustainable scales. So what is your view on, not mining to death, but still making the renewable transition? Do you have any thoughts on how to kind of square that circle? Thanks.
Sure. I'll speak to that. And then I know we got off to a shaky late start here, but I have to go pick up my kid at school shortly. So we're going to have to wrap in 5 minutes. It's a very important point that you're raising. The renewable energy requires a bunch of rare earth minerals and stuff, and all of this stuff has environmental impacts. And so we have to do this in a different way, in a careful way, and honoring Indigenous, the UN Declaration and free, prior, and informed consent, and all of these things. That said, often I think the fossil fuel industry creates a lot of mischief with this whataboutism. The environmental impact of that mining compared to oil and gas doesn't hold a candle. That said, it's certainly important to me. I don't want people to take away the message from listening to me that all we have to do is swap out everything we do with fossil fuels and make it electric. That's not true. We actually have to change our lives. We actually have to change how we develop our cities. We have to change how we get around, not just moving from fossil fuel combustion cars to zero emission cars. We actually need to take a whole bunch of things that we do individually and do it collectively. So that's why investing in public transit is equally, if not more important than zero emission vehicles.
Ken, I'll go back to you, Ken. There's one more question from Mark. Can you take that, Seth?
Yeah, and all I'll wrap is just say we have to consume less. We have to meet this moment through our governments, and as individuals, we have to consume less. An awful lot of us have to consume less and share more.
Thank you. Mark, last question to you, and then back to Ken.
Hello again, Seth. Long time no see. You started with saying there were 3 things that said the feds were not serious about bending the curve quick enough. And number 2 was that the effort remains technical and we're not really winning hearts and minds. Beyond the Youth Climate Corps, do you have other suggestions? Because this is an area where I struggle as well.
Yeah. So first of all, the policies matter. If you're creating a youth climate core, if you're spending what it takes through a just transition transfer, you are in fact signaling that this is an actual emergency and inviting people to join. But it's also about the public messaging. So one of the other things I've called for is a climate emergency information board and a robust advertising campaign. Like, where the heck's the advertising from the government about the fact that this is an emergency and what causes it and what we can all do, right? Just in the last few months, the Environment Canada has started investing in some ads, and they're like about nature-based solutions. It's like they're going out of their way not to talk about fossil fuels. So that's part of it. I mean, in some ways, Mark, all you have to do is think about the first year of the pandemic, and it's been modeled for you. That looked and sounded and felt like a genuine mass invitation to look after one another and to meet this moment with daily, advertising and briefings and the rest of it. That's what's been missing. Before I go, I do want to say, these links that you've shared, we're looking for help on these campaigns, the Youth Climate Core and the Just Transition Transfer. You can find letter writing tools for both of them. But in particular, we're not going to win this just as individuals. It's really about connecting with the institutions in your lives, your trade union, local, your faith institution, your city council, and getting them to call for these things that are in fact transformative. And we're happy to help with model resolutions or letters or that kind of thing. The easiest thing is to sign up for our newsletter so that you stay informed about all of these efforts.
Thank you so much, Seth. Sorry to everyone for the technical problems, but I think everyone learned a lot today. Seth has very strong vision and communicates it very well. Thanks again, Seth. We'll leave it at that.